Welcome to the Think Christian podcast. I'm Josh Larson, your host. Here at TC, we believe there's no such thing as secular. That means not only will Brittany Howard, Megan Thee Stallion, and Ingrid Andress be at this year's Grammys, but yes, you'll be able to find God there too. I'm no Grammys expert. The Oscars are more my thing, but this year's nominees offered a great opportunity for me to check out some of the most significant music of the past year or so. Catching up with Brittany Howard, meeting the music of Ingrid Andress for the first time, finally taking the time to try and wrap my mind, my white middle-aged male mind, around what Megan Thee Stallion is all about. Those artists were the picks of Kathryn Freeman and Aarik Danielson. They're going to join me to dissect that music and consider the theological implications in it. We're going to talk about how we hold being made in the image of God, also how we understand God's unconditional love, and a few other things. I know your eyebrows were already raised about that Megan Thee Stallion mention, so we should probably get to her first. A couple of good friends are joining me now to form our Grammy roundtable, Kathryn Freeman and Aarik Danielson. I've got a more general question for both of you here at the top. I have a good sense of what the Oscars actually mean, what they represent, what it means to be nominated, what it means to actually win. I'm not so sure about the Grammys, though. So how important are the Grammys to you guys, just as music fans, and how important is it to the artists who are honored? Maybe, Kathryn, we'll start with you. What's your take on the Grammys in general?
I think it's hard. I think in the last few years, probably this is like an ongoing conversation about what the Grammys mean, especially for African-American artists who are oftentimes like shut out of the kind of big five categories, or even when they're nominated, even a few years ago when Adele won over Lemonade, right? Like Adele gets up and says, I don't know what else this woman has to do. Like she should have won Album of the Year for Lemonade. And so I do feel like there's a sense that I do think that the Grammys matter, but what exactly they mean. And even this year, the controversy of The Weeknd not being nominated, which, even if it's like, okay, well, what's the most popular album or that's like sold a lot of records, then he should have been nominated, right? Like that album was huge last year. And so, Super Bowl performance, and for him to be totally shut out is crazy. So I feel like the Grammys are still maybe searching for what they mean, and we as fans are still trying to understand what they mean. But I do think they matter. And I do think for the artists that win, it does feel in some ways you're being recognized by your peers or like industry insiders. And so I do think, I think the reason why people get so worked up about people being excluded, about people not winning, that to me says that they matter, right?
Okay. Yeah, that push and pull between popularity, Aarik, and artistry, however that's defined and who that's defined by, is definitely something that's at work with the Oscars. There's almost like a formula a movie has to have. Do you see that too with the Grammys?
Yeah, the Grammys, it is such a weird thing. Like, I feel like I kind of grew up on the Grammys, and they're still important to me, but I feel like they've maybe become less important over the years, especially when you start to trace like patterns in the Grammy fields. Like all the stuff that Kathryn said is so right on. And then, when you look at categories that maybe aren't quite as popular, like jazz or bluegrass or things like that, you kind of notice like if so-and-so is nominated, they're probably going to win. Like there are certain, maybe it's a little bit different than the Oscars in that Grammy voters are asked to be specialists in fields that they don't really know probably as much about. And so they kind of pick the familiar names, I thought that maybe this was a more recent trend. Like, I think maybe you grow up with the Grammys and you think, oh, they're maybe getting a little bit more confused, or maybe they've lost their way a little bit in recent years. But I was reading this great book by the music journalist Michelangelo Matos about the music year 1984, and he covers the Grammys from that year in pretty great detail. And you see, oh no, this is like the good things and the bad things about the Grammys have always been around. And so I agree with Kathryn. I think they do matter. I think they're a chance to introduce certain artists to a more national stage, and they are really the one award for music that goes beyond popularity, past the AMAs, past the billboards, whatever MTV is still doing with Video Music Awards. But yeah, I think you tend to see certain patterns that are probably not that different from patterns that we see throughout the rest of the arts and the rest of society. So
Yeah, they serve that introductory purpose for me, absolutely, as I kind of keep up with music tangentially, but there are always names that come up with the Grammys who I faintly heard of or hadn't heard of at all. And that's why I asked you two to kind of look at the nominees, the list of nominees, and choose a few names you thought would make for good discussion, especially from a TC perspective. Kathryn, now you're not messing around. You came back with Megan Thee Stallion, the sexually explicit Houston rapper, a challenging choice, I've got to say. And you wanted to pair her with Best Country Song, Best Country Album, and Best New Artist nominee, Ingrid Andress. We should say Megan herself nominated for Best New Artist as well, and also nominated for Best Rap Performance, Best Rap Song, and Record of the Year, those last two for Savage. So yeah, Ingrid Andress, new to me. And so I wasn't quite sure, Kathryn, how you were going to pair these two. And then I saw the name of Andress's Grammy-nominated album, Ladylike. And so I started to get an idea of what you might have been going for there. But why don't you go ahead and explain why you wanted to talk about these two together?
They both are challenging the idea of like what it means to be like ladylike. And I think for Christians, a chance to like consider what we think about like what does it mean to be a biblical woman, right? And I see that so much even in like Megan Thee Stallion is challenging so much about what it means, a critique on society about how Black women are viewed or how they're treated. I mean, and I will say, there is a problem with like the over-sexualization of Black women. And so like her lyrics do feed into that in a way. But I thought like I picked Shots Fired. So for those of you who don't know, like last year, Megan Thee Stallion was shot. She was assaulted. And it became kind of like this huge thing of like, she should have protected the person who shot her, like she's lying. And this idea that like Black women aren't worthy of the same level of protection, that Black women are like aggressive. And so like whatever happened to her, she brought on herself, right? And so I think for that, and so Shots Fired is kind of, she's talking about that incident. And then she kind of pairs in her experience of feeling unprotected with what happened last year to Breonna Taylor, right? Which even in that shooting, asking the same questions, right? Like who is worthy of protection? Who should feel safe in their own home? So it is kind of like a societal critique, but I picked those songs because I thought for Christians, it asked good questions of like, what is it that is biblical about being a woman that is from the Bible? And then what is it that's about culture? And with Ingrid, I love her. I have fallen into an Ingrid Andress thing after seeing the Grammy nominations. And I will say, as someone who like loves country music, women in country are historically always underlooked. They don't get the same radio play as men in country. So I thought it was fascinating that this year that most of the best country album nominees were all women, because they are making excellent music. And, there's just a problem in that industry about how women's music is valued. But I thought like Ladylike was so great because she's questioning this. Like, she's like, I talk about politics, she's like, I smoke, I'm kind of wild. I'm not this sort of, especially for like Southern culture, right? Like this like demure, like pearl wearing, like quiet, like don't offend. Ladylike challenges that. And so then it's like, what is Southern culture and what does it mean to be a lady? And I think as Christians, particularly, and like white evangelical culture, like a lot of what we say is like a biblical woman is, Southern culture or just generally kind of cultural, like this idea that, okay, it's not ladylike to talk about politics. Well, is that accurate? Like, can you be a woman and be politically engaged and have opinions and advocate? And I would say, yeah, I mean, if you look at the Bible, like let's look at Esther, or Miriam and or Deborah, and you have all of these examples that kind of challenge this idea that to be a biblical woman is to be quiet. And so I put those two together because I felt like in their own kinds of ways, they're critiquing this idea of like, what does it mean to be like ladylike?
Yeah, and listening to their music together and try to pair them, you definitely see that both seem to be responding to this and intentionally provoking. Both of them are this patriarchal structure that's unjustly defined them. So, and that includes their sexuality, right? And it's trying to define them in a way that denies their imago Dei, ways that don't celebrate them as being made in God's image, but instead are sort of trying to control them and often control them toward male desire. So, and as you point out, Kathryn, for Megan Thee Stallion as a Black woman, those forces are particularly brutal and acute. I found this review of her album, Good News at Pitchfork, that was really helpful for me. This was written by Mankapur Kanta. Says, like always, Megan locates her power in the bedroom, the mirror, and the recording booth. And so I understand the pushing back on that patriarchal control in all of those areas, right? So think beauty, sex, musical ability. These are gifts from God. And I guess the question is, how do we hold these gifts? And you've given some biblical models there, I think, for how to hold those gifts. And then we can ask, okay, is someone like Ingrid Andress, someone like Megan Thee Stallion, their music, how are they holding those gifts so that it might honor their own imago Dei? I'm not the person, I'm not in the place, and I don't have the musical experience, expertise with their music to even say, but I wonder if those are maybe helpful questions to ask.
I think that's exactly right. And I think, I mentioned just how patriarchal like country music is, but I think it's across the board with like music. I mean, last year's Grammys, the big critique was that women were underrepresented in a lot of the categories. And so I think this year they tried to sort of course correct. But I do think I think what you said is exactly true. It's like, what does it mean to be imago Dei in a way that is defined, by God and by scripture, and not by sort of I think the idea of like locating your power in like sex or the bedroom, right? Like even trying to like say that you're like reclaiming that is, I think, still building into this like culture of like, as a woman, like your value is in your sexual desire or sexual performance. And I think, God locates it other places. And so I do think those are valuable questions. And I think even just thinking about like Ingrid, who I love, and I think she reminds me a lot of like early Taylor Swift. I got that vibe too. Yeah, she's like a really clever writer. But even that, like, I want more from women than just to be like rebelling against whatever men think, right? Because to me, even that is a very limited vision, right? Like that's only going to get you so far. And I think, God's view and like the biblical view of like, what does it mean to be flourishing? What does it mean to be imago Dei? What does it mean to be beloved is so much bigger and more wonderful than just like, I'm just going to reject whatever men think about me, or like, I'm just going to be challenging these like patriarchal structures. And so how do we get back to that like bigger, grander, more beautiful vision? And I think, I do think both Megan and Ingrid are offering valuable cultural critiques or pushbacks, but I would say even that is like a very kind of like limited vision. And I think God has so much more and like bigger for us. And I will say, I would be remiss as like the resident Beyonce expert if I didn't also throw in Savage, which I think is still fits into this conversation of, like women can contain multitudes. Like you can be, savage. Like you don't have to be all the time one single thing, whether or not it's like a good thing, right? Like we don't like this in women as much, this sort of like braggadocio. I think Megan brings a level of confidence that is oftentimes, we don't like that in women. And so, and I think Beyonce kind of joins her there in that song. But yeah, I do think they're offering like a really valuable critique of like, what is, our societal expectations of women and who they get to be. But I would say like, the idea of like locating your power in those three places. Like to me, that's such a limited vision of power, right? Like we have so much more. Like God has given us so much more.
So Aarik, I'd love to get your thoughts on any of that, but I'm also really curious to hear just what you think in terms of these artists musically. It's probably harder to compare them on that front. I think just very different sounds from the both of them.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, for one thing, I love the production and just the arrangements on both of those records. Like the Ingrid Andress stuff, I think the early Taylor Swift comparison is really good. I really like the melding of country and pop in a way that honestly too reminded me of a lot of like 70s artists, kind of a Carole King vibe, or even some of the kind of women of country in the 70s that would have been playing, on your AM radio dial. So I really like that. And then the thing that really struck me, I spent more time honestly with Megan Thee Stallion recently than I have in the recent past, but like the way that she uses her voice, the cadences that she, works into her songs, and just the way that she uses her voice is fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I'm with you, Josh. I don't feel like it's really my place to say a lot about like what they're accomplishing. And Kathryn has said so many great things. I think one of the things that's been really helpful for me, especially listening to Good News, the Megan Thee Stallion record, was just to take her on her own terms. You know, I think Kathryn's right in that we can ask for more than simply the things that she's saying or the things that she's rejecting. But it was just good for me to take her on her own terms, to hear her out, to sit with her story as she's telling it. And I think for me, like, I am constantly trying to remind myself that my picture of who God is, my picture of what the Imago Dei means, is incomplete without people like Megan Thee Stallion in it. If I don't know her, if I don't know about her story, if I don't see her for who she is, I'm missing something in my picture of what the fullness of God looks like in people. And so, I don't know, just for me, that was just my biggest takeaway was that it was honestly a treat to sit down with her story, to hear it more, and to just kind of have my vision of who she is and what she's doing just kind of more rounded out, I guess.
Yeah, and there was also an essay at Pitchfork that was really helpful to that end, that kind of encapsulated the whole year that she's had, which you touched on a lot of those events, Kathryn, and put some of the music in that context was helpful for me. So we'll maybe link to both of those pieces in the show notes for this episode. Anything else, Kathryn, since these were your picks that you wanted to touch on before we move on?
I will just say, also make a pitch for, I think it was last year, Megan Thee Stallion also wrote a New York Times editorial.
That's right.
About Black women and sort of the Breonna Taylor thing. And I would say the thing is, so to me, that's always so interesting about Megan Thee Stallion, and you get this a little bit of Savage, like, she does contain multitudes. Like, it is very sexually explicit, but it's also so Houston. And she's also a senior in college this year. She'll graduate, I think, in May with a degree in like health administration. Like, she wants to open like a nursing home or like health facility for elderly patients. And so it's like, when you see that and you like listen to sort of the like, you know, the braggadocio that comes through on, you know, Shots Fired or Girls in the Hood. And then you see this like sort of then with her like larger vision of who she is, it's like, yeah, like, oh, you can see where like Savage kind of intersects with that. And like, I think what Aarik said is perfect. Like, yeah, she sitting with her story, it's so much bigger than even portrayed or you hear in Good News. And I would say, yeah, I love Ingrid, and I hope that she's the future of country music. She might end up taking the Taylor Swift route and going totally pop. But yeah, I would highly recommend her album. I think it's kind of a fun, light country listen.
So that's Ingrid Andress and Megan Thee Stallion. When we come back, we'll turn to Aarik's pick, which is Brittany Howard. Now, Howard has been nominated for Best Rock Song, that's for Stay High, and Best Alternative Music Album for Jamie. Also nominated for Best Rock Performance, Best American Roots Performance, and Best R&B Performance. So apparently she can do everything. We'll be right back.
It's amazing how much really interesting music you can find if you dig deeper into the Grammy nominations than the top few categories. Hello, John J. Thompson, your in-house DJ here, and when it comes to the Grammy Awards, I have a unique perspective, I think. On one hand, as a lifelong fan of, let's call it, less mainstream music, I have long felt that the Grammy telecast has not done a very good job of casting light on all the excellent music being made outside of the top 40. The thing is, the Grammys are one of the few major awards that are set up to be nominated and voted on by actual musicians and music professionals, and not merely given out based on popularity or sales. As such, they are a great way to discover some of the best music released each year. But boy, do you have to get past the shiny objects up there at the top. I have actually worked on the screening committee for the Grammys many times. I've seen the process up close and personal, and it really is driven by creatives. Fortunately, you have me to make your digital crate digging that much simpler, and as I do with every episode, I have pulled together a special playlist to ride alongside this 2021 Grammy episode of the podcast, and this time I have culled 75 songs for your listening pleasure. Many of the big names are there, of course, but we do go a lot deeper on this list into rock, folk, country, gospel, and even the world music categories. Oh, and did you know that 4 of the 5 nominees in the Best Rock Song category are women this year? How cool is that? If you give me a few hours, or actually just under 5 hours, I'll take you on a musical tour of which artists, songwriters, and producers said were the best releases of 2020, including tracks from Tame Impala and Black Pumas that you would have heard if you were listening to the audio version of this podcast on another platform, but that we can't play on this version because YouTube's bots can't tell that we are actually using those song clips in a legitimate way, so they just take the whole episode down. In order for you to hear this music, you'll just need to click over to Spotify and join me there. Just click the Think Christian profile and follow it. You'll see this list as both its own list and the latest episode for a while. The songs will also be added to our massive archive list if you're looking to really go down a rabbit hole. Enjoy and let me know what you think by tweeting at me at John J. Thompson or reaching out to me through my blog at truetunes.com. As we said on our Best of 2020 episode, last year was a fascinating year for music. It's interesting to see how a global pandemic and corresponding disasters work their way through the creative community and find their way into our songs in various ways. Tune in and listen along. Until next time, this is JJT right there with you in the grooves. Bye-bye.
Welcome back to the TC Podcast. I'm Josh Larson, joined again by Kathryn Freeman and Aarik Danielson. Aarik, before the break, I mentioned Brittany Howard's 5 Grammy nominations, which speaks to her wide-ranging talent in a variety of genres. Bring us up to speed on her, because I first heard about her a few years ago when she was leader of Alabama Shakes, but now she's on her own, right?
I appreciate that you already pointed out that she's nominated in, I think, 3 or 4 different genre categories, which actually surprised me when I reminded myself of that this week, that really goes against the patterns that I was talking about with the Grammys before. I don't think they usually do things like that. But yeah, Brittany Howard, I think most known to folks for leading Alabama Shakes. And that's a band that really evolved a lot over the course of only really 2 records, I think. When they put out their debut, I thought it was a good record. I liked her vocals on that, but it was very in line with a lot of other kind of neo-soul bands, and I felt like there wasn't a ton to distinguish it. And then 2015, they put out Sound and Color, which was kind of another Grammy darling, and it just felt like their sound evolved into something that still had those soul underpinnings, but was much stranger at its core. And I think you hear that evolution continuing with Jamie, which is the album that all these songs are nominated from. I think technically Alabama Shakes is still a thing. I don't know if they're going to keep going. I think I heard her, I want to say it was on Mark Maron's podcast, where she kind of talked about doing her own thing. And it felt like there was a lot of ambiguity as to whether they'll get back together. Although I know at least one of the guys in that band was pretty heavily involved in this solo album. But as best as I understand the story, she went through kind of this intense period of writer's block and took a road trip and came back with, kind of ideas about how to write about her own family and her relationships and just all of these stories that she hadn't really dug around. And so the result was this record, Jamie, named for her late sister. And again, it's that evolution. Like the best way that I can think of to describe Brittany Howard's music is like somebody took an old soul record and just let it sit out in the sun for a long time until kind of the edges warped a little bit. It's kind of like you take an old Sister Rosetta Tharpe album or something and let it kind of melt around the edges. And it's still got that great soul sound to it. But there's just, wonderful kind of little weird flourishes and kind of musical alterations. And so I think she's operating at a really high level. And I was excited to see that she got as much love from the Grammys as she did.
Kathryn, have you had a chance to check out some of her music? Does that description sound right to you?
Yeah. Sound and Color, to this day, like one of my favorite albums ever. Yeah. I think that I love that description of it. It's like a soul album that sits out and gets like warped. Because the core of it, and her voice is so, I think, just reminds me of that era so much. And so I just love the things that it does have that core, but the ways in which she's kind of like evolved that sound, or like how she kind of blurs it and mixes it. I'm not surprised that she was nominated across genres, but I do think that's like very uncommon. I think the only thing I can think of like recently in comparison, I think like Lemonade got some like outside of R&B pop. Like I think it was nominated for like best rock song. Like there was a song that was nominated in best rock song category. But yeah, I wasn't surprised because she does such interesting things with her voice and her sound. And I'm a big Brittany Howard fan.
Yeah. The only artist, I think Beyonce is a good comparison. The only other artist that I can really like even begin to kind of put her in company with are people like Prince or Janelle Monáe, in that you hear their records and you say, okay, I know the parts that they're working with here, but what the whole is really hard to describe. And I really like that you can kind of point out the individual ingredients, but kind of the end result is this kind of inventive thing that kind of, it defies classification enough that you have to put it in multiple categories, I guess.
Yeah. Would you say that's a quality? One of the songs I know you wanted to highlight is 13th Century Metal, which I think you described as just being very, very, very weird or something. Is that a quality that one has, you'd say?
Oh, for sure. I mean, that's basically, for folks who haven't heard the album, I mean, it's essentially a spoken word track over kind of this crazy soundscape that is driven by guitars and drums. And she brought in some really cool musicians on this record. One of which is Robert Glasper, who's a pretty well known jazz and R&B keyboardist, and has done a lot of work in hip hop too. And I think he co-wrote that song. And she's compared it, if I'm remembering right, she's compared it in other places to kind of her version of like Gregorian chant or like church music from, the Renaissance, that it's like the modern day version of that. And so, yeah, I mean, that's probably the strangest thing on the album. That's probably the most like extreme example. But yeah, you can just see all of these elements colliding and then making something new in what she's up to.
Well, definitely more familiar, I think, or less experimental, I should say, is another song, He Loves Me. And in this one, Howard begins at the top, about not going to church anymore, and then other maybe less pious decisions that she's making. But then she says she knows he still loves me. And listening to that, just appreciating the music and her voice, of course, and also thinking about it testing this idea of God's unconditional love to the breaking point, maybe. So I'd love to hear what you made of that song, Aarik, and then get your thoughts too, Kathryn.
Yeah, I mean, that song is really great musically. And I think one of the things, I hadn't really thought about this until we started talking, but I think this in a lot of ways overlaps with what Kathryn was saying about Megan and Ingrid Andress. Like, I think the theme that I see a lot in Jamie, and maybe some of it has to do with being, separated or purposely separated from her longtime band, is this theme of freedom. And I think on He Loves Me, there's kind of the freedom from restriction that is kind of talked about, where she's saying, I don't have to kind of keep these rules anymore to be loved by God. And then you go to a song like 13th Century Metal, and there's kind of a freedom to do something. It's the freedom to stand alongside people, to advocate for others, to, love your neighbor as yourself, that sort of thing. And so I've been thinking a lot about those two songs in league with each other, because to me, they do represent, even on the same album, kind of this evolution or this path of like, if I am, she's arguing, if I am freed from these restrictions, but still live under the love of God, still do everything coram Deo, before the face of God, then I can kind of be free to go out and act in the world in a way that's for other people's good too. And so, whether or not you would agree with some of the decisions that she talks about in that song, and He Loves Me, I do think there's something really beautiful there about being freed to ultimately be a blessing to others, being free to care about other people, kind of throwing off your own restraints, and then being able to kind of face the wider world because of that. So yeah, it's a really interesting song, and I know it's one of those things that the lyrics on its face would probably upset a lot of people, but I don't know. I guess I appreciate at least the spirit behind it.
How about you, Kathryn? What'd you make of He Loves Me?
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of like the story of the prodigal son, right? Who just, goes out and is like living kind of wild, and then is met with this kind of like, wildly loving greeting by his dad for just coming home. And I think this idea, I think that sometimes our sort of human definition of love is just to do whatever we want and there to be like no restriction on that. But I do appreciate, which I don't think is correct, but I do appreciate an idea about a song of like, you're never too far from the love of God, right? Like you cannot, like to the extent that you're willing to like receive it, it's there. And I think that is a message that I think is important to be reminded of, even for like Christians, because I do think sometimes we get really caught up in like doing things for God, even those of us who have like, using her kind of own words of like, we've chosen to live under those restrictions, that we get sort of like the son who stays, right? Like we get so focused on, we have done all the right things, and we lose the ability to understand that sort of unconditional, like wild love of God. And I think the song is a good reminder, even for us, that like, it's not about what we do. It really is like, we love him because he loved us first. And so I do appreciate, I think that is just always like a beautiful reminder of like, yeah, God loves you unconditionally in a way that we don't have the capacity, I think, to fully understand. And so, yeah, I thought it was a good, even if you don't agree with like the decisions she has made in her singing of that song. But I think there's something really beautiful and just, he still loves me. Like, yeah, he does.
It's just as you were talking about that, it almost feels like there is it's like the adult version of a very childlike expression. You know, we sing like, yes, Jesus loves me. And this is certainly, you know, a song that you wouldn't sing at VBS, but like, you know, that idea that like, I think we do. I mean, I think there are implications to being loved and we don't love, you know, we're loved and we love back in a relationship. There's covenant there. But I think Christians are scared sometimes to make the statements that Brittany Howard is making in that song that like, no, these are actually true statements. You can do these things and he still loves you. You know, I think we're so conditioned to put conditions on that love and to preface it. And so, you know, if nothing else, I appreciate that the song exists to just say that. And it's true. And there's nothing, ultimately, I think that you can argue with those statements on their face that we don't have to be frightened of that it's really good for us to be reminded that, you know, what I might put in that song, if I wrote it, might be differently. I do this and he still loves me, but we all need to hear that he still loves us no matter what.
That's good. Yeah, you can I love that idea of like putting your own, like, this is the thing I still do, and he still loves me. I love that. For
sure. So do either of you still watch the Grammys? I mean, I'm still a sucker for the Oscars and I end up watching them. You've got a lot of artists here that you're fans of who will be there. Maybe, I don't know what they're even doing for it this year, if it's going to be mostly remote, but is this something you make time to actually watch each year, or do you just like to talk about it and listen to the music?
Oh, I definitely watch because you just never know. Oh, maybe it was 2 years ago. Like Tori Kelly got like a little snippet of time and it was funny watching on Twitter, people reacting like, who is this girl? She like, you know, and then I think of like a Kendrick Lamar performance that just is like still like one of my favorite of his like all time performances. You know, Beyonce always brings it when she performs at the Grammys. So I love to watch them, honestly, more than who wins the awards, because I'm not really clear what winning means. Like, okay. I actually enjoy watching them more than even who like wins.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, I still try to watch them. I think I've probably missed a few years here and there, but it is one of those few times that like so many of the people that you do care. I actually would have to go back and remind myself how they're doing it this year. But in typical years, so many of the people that you listen to and care about are actually in the same room. Like that never really happens. And so that's kind of cool. And I do think I think back to that Kendrick Lamar performance from a few years ago, like Kathryn said, and there's those moments that are those kind of like, you know, show stopping, you know, people are going to be talking about it for days afterwards, moments that I don't want to miss. I do find myself like, it's kind of like anything that you love, any institution that you love that you still kind of critique. I do find myself groaning a little bit through the Grammys every year because the collaborations sometimes feel really forced. And people have talked about, people other than me have talked about that, you know, Dave Grohl is like, I love Dave Grohl. I mean, Dave Grohl is my hair icon.
Yes.
But that he is the stand-in for rock. So it's like, we need a rock collaborator in this song. Let's just bring out Dave Grohl and we'll bring out 3 or 4 other people and we've got ourselves a thing. And I don't know that always works, but yeah, I do love just kind of seeing like so much of the music community in one room and just kind of seeing what will happen. Like Kathryn said, I'm definitely more interested in the moments in between the award presentations than the awards themselves. So
yeah. Well, thank you to both for guiding me through some of this year's nominees. Let people know where they can follow you guys either on social media or somewhere else, and just keep up with more of your thoughts on music and other stuff. Aarik, where should people follow you?
Yeah, best place is probably on Twitter, which is just at Aarik Danielson, which is spelled counterintuitively. But if you're watching or listening to the show, you can find my name in the show notes. So
yep. How about you, Kathryn?
Same for me on Twitter, just at Kathryn Annette.
Are you both going to be tweeting during the Grammys this year? Will people, is that something you do, or do you like to sit back and just take them in? It sounds like you're on Twitter, Kathryn.
Yeah, I know. I feel like you have to watch. It's like a communal experience. I feel like you miss. Yeah, I feel like Twitter and like live tweeting has added such a fun element to it. So yeah, I will be tweeting. I'll be live tweeting the Grammys.
Yeah, I won't make any promises, but I probably will be too. This is more of my Super Bowl than the Super Bowl would be for sure. Okay. So there's a good chance that I'll at least weigh in on a couple of things. So
sounds good. All right. Thanks again to you both. Well, hopefully we pointed you in the direction of some new music with this episode. Thanks again to Kathryn Freeman and Aarik Danielson for joining me. I also wanted to thank listeners and viewers for your participation in our last episode, Pop Culture Pastors. We got some great suggestions for clergy people in movies, music, and TV, including this one that came in from TC writer Jonathan Cana. Came in after the episode aired. I was a little surprised that no one mentioned Father Mulcahy from MASH, specifically the TV show. As the spiritual center of the franchise, he lives out his theology in a way that makes his faith both compelling and attractive, never oppressive or hypocritical. Like Jesus, he's a consummate servant leader, infinitely patient, infinitely gracious, almost ethereally generous and compassionate, yet remarkably courageous and bold in the face of circumstances that would make any ordinary pastor shudder. Thank you for that, Jonathan. As always, you can send us your feedback, any thoughts you have about the show by emailing us at tcpodcast@thinkchristian.net. You can also connect with us on Facebook and Twitter. Find us at Think Christian. And to make sure you don't miss any of the articles that we post on our website, just subscribe to receive our emails at thinkchristian.net/subscribe. For our YouTube viewers, you missed out on some samples of the music we discussed and a few tracks from John J. Thompson's Spotify playlist for this episode. You can find the audio version of the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, and you can find that playlist by searching for the Think Christian playlist on Spotify. The Think Christian podcast is a production of Reframe Ministries, a family of programs designed to help you see your whole life reframed by God's gospel story. Visit reframeministries.org for more info. Our audio engineer and post-production supervisor is John Reeder, and Reframe's co-director overseeing content strategy is Robin Basley. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks to consider how another aspect of our pop culture fandom connects with our faith.